Well, hello there. So today I'm going to be going over all of the books that I read in March. I had a lot of reading time and a lot of downtime because of the quarantine and the social distancing and everything, so I had a lot of reading time, which was very nice. So, to get to the number, I read 21 books in March. Thank you very much. Thank you. It goes to show that I don't have a social life. So yeah, anyway. So I had a lot of fun reading all of these books and I just want to go over kind of what I thought of them, what books I read, maybe how many stars I gave them, and just kind of show you all the books that I read. So I'm going to go over physical books that I have, and then when that's done, I'm going to go through all of the audiobooks that I've read, because I don't have any way of showing you that, in a physical book. So I'm just going to go through physical books, and then we'll get into audiobooks. So the first book that I read was Sex Object by Jessica Valenti, and I read another book by her later in the month, which I'll tell you about later, but this is a memoir about her life, and she is a feminist author and writes a lot about the problems in society related to feminism. She writes about sex positivity and the strains that are put on women, especially in purity culture. So this is just a memoir talking about some of her sexual experiences and experiences with men, experiences with her own body, and it kind of takes the form of a memoir because she's telling stories about her life, but it kind of paints a picture of what it's like to be a, sexual person, sexual woman in the 21st century America. So it's definitely an interesting read. I gave this one 5 stars. I actually listened to this one on audio, and then right before the quarantine happened, I ran to a bookstore near my school, and I ended up picking this up so that I could have it because it's just a really great read and very enlightening too. So definitely would recommend this one. So that was the first physical book that I read. Well, I read it on audio, but there you go. And the next one is The Other Mother by Carol Goodman. This one, actually, I also read on audio. I'm so bad, I know. I just keep listening to audiobooks, falling in love with books, and then buying them. But this is really because the person who wrote this, Carol Goodman, I don't know if you can see, was my professor at my college for short story class. So right before everything happened, my school closed and everything, I went out and bought this book because I had read the book on audio before that, and then I really figured that if I wouldn't see her again, I really wanted her to sign my copy. So I got the copy, I got it signed, she personalized it and everything, and now I have this to remember a wonderful class, wonderful teacher, and a really, really good book. This is a 5-star book, and it is about 2 moms who have small children who have post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic psychosis, and it's very thrilling, very psychological, and there's a lot of twists and turns to it. I wouldn't recommend this if you're very sensitive to topics of, things like that about post-traumatic psychosis and psychosis in general. If you're not interested in that, definitely don't read this because it's definitely a lot, but I really like those kinds of stories, so I really, really enjoyed this book. Gave it 5 stars. It was great to have a month where I gave a lot of books 5 and 4 stars. It was a good reading month for sure. Alright, moving on, I read Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This was a book that I read for British Lit. I'm currently still in the process of writing a research paper about it, but I didn't like this book at all. I believe I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars because there were parts of it that I definitely could understand the point of. Like, I understood how it connected to Victorian England, and I understood, the importance of a lot of what was being said, and I got a lot of information out of it. However, it wasn't an interesting read. It was not pleasing or enjoyable in any way. So 2 out of 5 stars for this one. Alright, moving on to some poetry that I read. I have a bunch of poetry that I still haven't read, and I'm going to be doing some kind of a reading vlog with that over this month since it's now poetry month. but I just wanted to mention these, which I read this month to try to chip away at some of the books that I have acquired but haven't read yet. So this is Honeybee by Tristan Mattier, and I actually haven't rated this book yet because I had very, very high hopes for this book. I had been waiting for it forever, couldn't find it in any bookstore, and I finally found it, and I was so excited. It's beautiful. It's one of my all-time favorite covers of a book. And I just didn't love it. It's kind of depressing because I was waiting for it for so long, so excited about it, and I just don't like it. It feels very stereotypical, kind of elementary style poetry, like not really delving into things, only going surface level. And I think there's kind of a problem that I have with modern poetry now. I read Cult of Two, also by Michael Faudet, and this is the 5th book by him that I've gotten. I read Dirty Pretty Things, which is the first poetry book in this kind of series, and I loved it so much. So I immediately went out and got the rest of his poetry books because I thought these are amazing. I love them. It just has kept going downhill from there, and this one is a 1-star read. So both of these are about love and romantic relationships, and I really think that I'm tired of some of the tropes of modern poetry. I fully support modern poetry, don't get me wrong. Like, I think it's accessible, I think it's important, I think it has a great position in order to reach people who don't really get access to poetry, who aren't reading a lot, and this gives them access. And to me, that is so important. Literature is not meant to be this elite thing that no one can access. It's meant to be accessible to everybody and to be read by everyone. That's why we have public libraries and apps that we can listen to books on and things like that. It's meant to be accessible. So I really appreciate modern poetry for that, but I'm having a hard time now that I have taken some classes at college and read some really great poetry, both classic poets, but also newer poetry that's not quite in the modern poetry sphere that we think of, like Instagram poetry and things like that. So I definitely have a wider, I guess, thought on poetry now, modern poetry, and I don't think that these kinds of modern poetry really satisfy me in the same way that other poetry does. So anyway, long story short, both of these were probably 1 stars, even though I haven't really rated this one yet, because it's just so sad. Alright, so I'm going to mention 2 books that if you've seen my reading vlog that I posted, it was one of the first videos that I posted on the channel. I read both of these books during the reading vlog, so I'm not going to go too in-depth about my reviews of them, because if you watch that, and if you haven't, you can go check it out. But I've kind of in-depth talked about both of these. So my thoughts is this one, I believe I gave 3 out of 5 because there were some good things, some kind of less enjoyable parts to it. I think for the audience, which is a young adult audience, I think this is a really wonderful guide and resource for a teenager. So I would definitely recommend it to a younger teenager. However, I wasn't the target audience necessarily, so it did feel a little juvenile or a little bit too basic at times. But yes, this is definitely a great guide, and I did appreciate it for the history that it talked about. And then there is A Woman's Place by Deepi Aluwalia. And I believe I also gave this one 3 stars, as it was definitely informative, had really nice pictures. It was a really enjoyable read for the most part. The only thing that I had a problem with was just, I don't know, anthologies are hard to give star ratings to. Anthologies are really difficult to pinpoint exactly what you think of them, because there are parts that you love, parts that you don't like, and I have a hard time giving anthologies a star rating like that. So I think I gave this 3 stars, but again, if you want more in depth about it, go over and check that video out. Alright, moving on to a children's book that I read. This is the only children's book that's on this list. Usually from month-to-month videos or month-to-month, reading, I only do, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 regular books, and I'll do, a lot of children's books because At my job, I do a lot of reading children's books so that I can recommend them to people. When new books come in, I read those. I read for story time at my job. I work at a library. So I read a lot of children's books, but this month I haven't really been at work a lot because of everything being closed. So this was the one children's book I read, and it is This Is How We Do It by Matt Lamothe. And oh my goodness, this is the sweetest, most lovely children's book I could ever recommend. It's about all of these families in all different countries. The author went and spoke to all of them and got kind of a idea of their life. This is his portrait, adaptations of the photographs of the families. But he goes through and he kind of says, this is what my life looks like. So this is what I eat for breakfast in all the different countries. And it shows the different foods. And this is what this is how I spell my name. That's a really sweet page. So it's just all the different ways of writing children's names in other countries. And I think it really gives kids and even adults an idea of everyone is different, but you can still see the same love and affection and the same qualities in people all around the world. And you don't have to be divided over it. So I liked seeing how unique everyone was, but also how everyone can collectively experience the same humanity. So I would definitely recommend this if you have kids or you're interested in just children's books in general. I love, love, love this book. All right, the second to last physical book that I read was Wish Tree by Catherine Applegate. And no one can definitively say if this is a children's book or an adult book because I found it on a whim, completely randomly, walked into Barnes & Noble to pick up a different book in that A section of the adult fiction, and I saw this and it immediately, I had a spiritual bond with it. I needed it and hadn't heard of anything about it, and it really looks like a children's book. It's small, the font is large, there's illustrations, and what it discusses, it's actually from the perspective of a tree telling the story, and it discusses themes of racism, and it discusses how children can come together to save a community, and how animals and trees come together to save the community, because a lot of what this has to do with is the animals that the tree, is housing. So it was just a beautiful book. I gave it 5 stars. Absolutely loved this book. My mom and I actually buddy read it, so she read it quickly and then I read it, and we both really enjoyed it. So I just don't know if it's a children's or an adult book, but I'm really fine with that because it's just a wonderful book. So if you're interested in reading a possibly adult book that feels like a children's book, this is for you. All right, and finally, the one that I have been waiting to talk about for so long, Educated by Tara Westover. So I think I mentioned in a previous video, I got this for Christmas last year, and I picked it up that day, read 50 pages, and then never touched it since. I think I just kept having other things I needed to read for school, for work, whatever, personal reading that came before this book, and I never got to finish it. And oh my god, I wish I would have finished it earlier because it is so good. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's a pretty, popular book. It was a New York Times bestseller. It's about a woman who grows up in a very Mormon and extremist family, and it's about her kind of breaking away from that and learning to go to college. She goes to Cambridge. She's very successful, but it's about her family dynamics and how she changed to kind of move away from that family dynamic. And it is a beautifully read, very, very interesting book. That being said, I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and the only reason that I kind of took away that half star is the fact that she keeps saying she's going to change over and over again, and she keeps having these moments of inspiration, oh, I've changed everything, and then in the next chapter she's right back with her family, right back under an abusive situation. And as that really speaks to the nature of abuse, especially in a family dynamic, when you want your family and you love your family, but you are being abused. It's really, really difficult to escape that. However, as a reader who understands that dynamic well, but also it's a little difficult to handle, or a little difficult to enjoy hearing the same, I'm really down, this is happening to me, and then back up to, I've changed, I have a different perspective now, and then back down again. It's a little bit difficult to kind of, I don't know, rationalize why that's happening. So that's my only complaint with this. Otherwise, amazing, amazing read. Okay, so moving on to the audiobooks I read. So, beginning the month, I read, where is it? I read The Personality Brokers by Merv Emery. And it looks like this. And as I said, it was an audiobook that I got on Libby, which is the only app that I use for audiobooks currently. And I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars, and it was about the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which I'm sure you've seen before. It's now online as 16 personalities, and I never realized like the history of that test and how incredibly unscientific it is. Like, it is so unscientific, I can't even tell you, but it's a really interesting read. It did feel a little bit long, and it got a little bit boring at times, but if you're interested in kind of personality science, and if that even means anything, definitely check out that book. Then I read I'd Rather Be Reading: The Delights and Dilemmas of the Reading Life by Anne Bogle. And it's very, I guess it takes the nostalgic route. It's very nostalgic about reading. It's very, it kind of shows the good things about reading, what it means as a society, what it means to a person individually, and how it connects communities and connects people together. And it was definitely a wholesome, nice read. I definitely thought it embodied that spirit of bookishness that I have, that I know a lot of people also have. So I really appreciated it for that. I give it 3 stars. It wasn't like mind-blowing or anything. It was very, I already know all of this kind of information, but it was a fun, lighthearted thing to read. Alright, next I read Fly on the Wall by E. Lockhart, which looks like that. And I loved this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It was recommended time and time again on the Books Unbound podcast, which is my favorite podcast. And it's constantly recommended by Errol Bissett, who also runs that podcast. It is just such a funny, silly book. It's about a girl who wishes that she was a fly on the wall of the boys' locker room, and when she wakes up she is, and she starts to see all these boys coming in and has opinions about their bodies, and it's very funny, but it's also, it kind of shows that, you know, watch what you wish for one thing. But she was feeling very lonely and isolated before that, and afterwards she learns that she can have a community. And it's just a very sweet book, even though it's kind of it's kind of raunchy, but I really enjoy it anyway. Alright, the next book I read on audio was An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. And I also gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I'm very familiar with John Green's book, as you might have, I don't know if I've mentioned it, but The Fault in Our Stars is my all-time favorite book. I love it so much. I have multiple copies of it, and I love it. So having that coupled with the fact that I've watched Vlogbrothers, which is Hank Green and John Green together on YouTube since like 2010, I definitely was very excited for this to come out. However, I'm not a huge sci-fi person, and this book is very science fiction heavy, so I wasn't sure if I would love it. Oh my god, even if you hate sci-fi, pick this up, because it is set in New York for the most part, but then it's set in other places as well. But set in New York, it's extremely realistic. It feels like realism. It feels like a contemporary book until this science fiction stuff starts happening. And you're like, is this sci-fi? Is this magical realism? What is this? Because it feels so real. So if you're interested in anything like that, check it out. It's amazing. I am so excited to read the second book. Then I read The Purity Myth by Jessica Valenti, which was the memoir that I talked about, Sex Object. That's also Jessica Valenti. And the cover looks like this. And it is all about the purity culture in America. So how the Christians treat that culture and how the mainstream also feed into that culture, and how they've kind of become so intertwined that everybody's feeding into purity culture. So it was definitely an interesting read. I actually read the physical book, but I had to return it because it was from the school library. So I was able to read that physically. But I gave it 3 stars because the information was sound, it was helpful, it was kind of confirmed things that I was feeling, so I felt very understood in that way. But also, it got a little bit long at times. I think parts of it could be condensed a little bit to make it more, I don't know, it didn't need to be 300 pages, I thought. It could have been 150 pages or 200 pages and just compressed a little bit, because there was a lot of information, but it was so spread out that I felt like it just could have been shorter and it would have been more enjoyable that way. Then I read My Lovely Wife by Samantha Downing, which I also read during the readathon. So if you want a more in-depth talk about that, I gave a whole bunch of information about it in my reading vlog. All I'm going to say is I gave it 2 stars. Wouldn't really recommend it. It felt like a lot of other, mystery kind of thrillers in its kind of genre of these like homey husband and wife dynamic thrillers. So definitely not a huge fan, but that's okay. Then I read The Life as We Knew It series by Susan Beth Pfeffer. That's the first book, Life as We Knew It. And then the second book is The Dead and the Gone. And the third book is This World We Live In. So this is a series that I read a long time ago for a book discussion, and I was like 10 or something, and I absolutely hated them. I thought they were so scary. The series is actually about when the moon comes close to the earth. It comes too close to the earth because it was hit with like a meteor or something like that, and it throws the tides off. There's natural disasters. Everyone's freaking out. There's no food. There's no water. Electricity's out. It's all just craziness. But this was at the beginning of quarantine, and I felt like I would have some kind of relation to it, like I would understand it and feel those books differently. And I have to say, they are YA and they're pretty juvenile, especially the first book. I didn't like the first book. I gave it 2 stars because it was very boring and not a lot of stuff happened in it. And then The Dead and the Gone, which is the second book, actually blew me away. I gave that 4 stars, and I loved that book. I don't know why, like out of the blue, that one was the one that I loved, but it was so interesting, and there were so many crazy things that happened. I loved it. And then the third book combines the character from the first book and the character from the second book together into one story, and I ended up giving it 3 stars, kind of in between of the 2 other books, because the main character in the second book was so great, but the main character in the first book was, didn't love her. So that's my review of that series. But it was interesting reading it again because I hadn't read it in 10 years. Alright, so then I read Misery by Stephen King, which is a classic, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I think the problem was that I was comparing it to the movie a lot because I had already seen the movie. And I think the movie is a lot more dynamic and has a lot more, conflict and action happening because it adds characters to kind of flesh out this craziness, and you kind of see the conflict more. And I don't love Stephen King's writing style. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to ever go on to more Stephen King because this was the one that I thought I would like the most and that would be the most palatable to me. And I still wasn't a huge fan. So, I don't know. Maybe I'll pick another one up again later, but probably not for a bit. And then the last book that I finished in March was The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. And this is the first translated fiction that I have read/listened to, and it was very interesting. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I thought that it was well written, well done. I think the main thing that I had with it was that I couldn't really understand the distinction between the character in the story, and the main character is a writer, so there was a story within the story that she was writing, and I think those two storylines got so intertwined and things were happening in both that paralleled the other, and I think because I was listening to an audiobook, I couldn't understand those transitions. So that was the only thing that kind of hindered me from fully enjoying the book, but I do think it was beautifully written. I think the topics were definitely interesting. I can see the parallels to 1984 that it talks about, so I definitely enjoyed the book. So anyway, those were the 21 books that I read this month. I think it was a pretty good reading month. There were a lot of 4 and 5 stars, but there were also a few 3 stars. So I would say it's a pretty good month. At least there weren't a ton of 1 and 2 star books that I read this month. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're staying inside and staying well. Just keep being bookish through this time, keep reading, and let me know in the comments what you're currently reading during this quarantine, and I'll see you next time. Bye!